Rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to Ahlulbayt Live, a live series that we've got running throughout the 10 days of Shahr Muharram. I'm delighted to be joined by Sheikh Jihad Ismail. Assalamu alaikum. He'll be giving live lectures every night at the Shabab Sibtain Center, and he's been kind enough to give us his time today. Thank you very much. Sheikh, we have a lot to get through, so if you don't mind, we'll go straight into the topic. And I'd like to highlight, obviously, that this is a live show, so if you have any calls, please do take this opportunity to pass your questions to the Sheikh. He is with us today, and I believe on Thursday. So, inshallah, please do take this opportunity. As we were discussing before the show, it wasn't just a coincidence, but to a certain extent, your name did inspire the topic of today, where we're looking at the term jihad, and we're looking at jihad in times of peace and war. Obviously, this is a time where we're commemorating the martyrdom of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. And obviously there was a major and a minor jihad happening there. But I don't want to take too much of your time. I'd like to just begin, for the benefit of myself and for the viewers, if you can highlight or elaborate on the definition of the term jihad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Allow me first and foremost to offer my condolences to Sahib al-Asr wa zaman, Ajjalallah ta'ala farajahu sharif, on this occasion marking the martyrdom anniversary of our beloved Imam Hussein salawatullah wa salamu alayhi. Interestingly, that you mentioned my name in the course of the discussion in regard to the topic of today, because this takes me back to when I first migrated to Australia, and after settling there for about maybe 5 or 6 years, I attended a dentist, and the receptionist asked me about my name. So she said, "What is your good Christian name?" I said, "Jihad." And she was dumbfounded, and she could not believe that my parents actually called me that name. So she responded by saying, "Are you telling me your name is Holy War?" And then I said, I laughed. I had to laugh, and I said, "Indeed not." And a conversation ensued, basically, between me and the receptionist. And I told her that it is unfortunately that the term jihad has been misconstrued and misinterpreted very highly in the media and by the terminology that people use. Right from the outset, for example, the interpretation itself is wrong. We don't have anywhere that suggests, for example, that the word jihad equates with war in the sense of being holy, because the term war in Arabic is harb, and jihad has got nothing to do with harb in that context. So I said, for example, let me give you an example in order to clarify the actual meaning of jihad. Firstly, jihad literally means to struggle, to strive in a particular facet of life. It doesn't have to be in a conflict-based situation. It can be in any given situation where you aspire to become a better person at something. So that constitutes jihad, from jahada or jahada, to exert that particular pressure on oneself in order to excel at what you want to achieve in life. So I said, "What are you?" She said, "I'm a Catholic by background." I said, "Good, excellent." I said, "Let's assume you go and live in a country where the Catholics are being persecuted, and I am being a citizen of that country. I come to your defense in order to basically give you your rights to practice Catholicism as you see it. In that context, I'm performing jihad in order to support your freedom of choice." She said, "Well, if that is the concept of jihad, then it's a good concept. It's not something to be frightened of, to be fearful of." I said, "Exactly." And that's why, for example, if you look at the classification of jihad, even within the Islamic terminology, even within the Islamic literature, you would find that the Prophet ﷺ made a very a great distinction between jihad of having to go to, for example, a battle or defend your rights in an armed, for example, conflict, or the jihad against the nafs or the soul or the temptations. And we find that the emphasis on fighting one's desires or temptation is far greater than that of, armed conflict. Where the Prophet, the classical example that most of my brothers and sisters are aware of, the hadith where a small battalion of Muslims came back after they had performed a particular skirmish on the outskirts of Medina, and they came back, the Prophet welcomed them. And he said, Marhaban billadina qadaw al-jihad al-akbar. Welcome to those who have just satisfied the minor jihad and now remains ahead the major jihad. So they were baffled. They thought what they were doing is beyond belief. It's the ultimate in any achievement a person could ever achieve. And so they inquired from the Prophet, what do you mean? He said, well, the major jihad is when you fight against your own self. Why is it so? Because if we can bring an upright citizen in the society and the community we live in, that upright citizen forms the community and the society we live in. Basically, what we are doing is we are training upright citizens for justice to prevail in the community, for equity to take place in the community. If that prevails, then there is no room for armed conflict anymore. And that's why it has a higher status than any other status, because it basically builds the human being. And that is the focus of religion. The focus of religion, Islam or otherwise, but in particular Islam, is to build the human being, to secure the human being against any other faults or shortcomings or whatever in his dealings and transactions in the society and the community that he lives in. Now, if we go to the minor jihad, of course, it comes under two classifications, or two branches, if I may say so, and that is the defensive or the offensive, or what they call the aggression. Well, in Islam, we don't have a form of jihad that is based on aggression, that is absolutely outlawed. We have what we call the defensive mechanism, and that defensive mechanism is very strictly highlighted in the Quran with certain conditions, with certain terms, even to the extent that we have verses in the Quran that stipulates that if you've been transgressed against and you take arms in order to fight against the aggression for self-protection or wealth protection or family protection or land protection or whatever the case may be, if after achieving the minimum of what you went out to do, and for example the enemy extends a hand of peace, immediately the Quran says go for it, and don't be the aggressors. So you would basically conclude from this that Islam is not about violence. It's never been about violence. It's never been about encouraging that sense of violence or endorsing that sense of violence. Rather, it's encouraging the building of the human being on the basis of morals, mannerism, justice, and so on and so forth, in order to basically eliminate any need for physical combat or battle on the ground.
Hassan, thank you very much. You highlighted that, very clearly the difference between this major idea or major jihad, minor jihad, etc. When we look at specifically this idea of major jihad, and we'll come to some of the things that you've mentioned, also referring back to history and obviously the battle of Karbala. And what I want to touch on when it comes to this major jihad is, because the definition is there as a struggle, or in some ways the idea of a conflict or a difficult struggle, so to speak. It's something that is warning you of a hardship, of a difficulty. It's not often when we talk about good mannerisms or building one's character. It's mostly seen as a positive thing. It's a positive kind of endeavor kind of thing. Again, I'm using the word endeavor. It's similar to this, but here it's like the definition suggests a kind of fight, a struggle, where there is a conflict. It's an inner conflict. Do we see that as a conflict within us when we think about these things? When we think about, for example, temptations. If I was to consider, for example, when I look at history where, conflicts were put upon the imams and they were performing the minor jihad, you can see that there's an enemy, a clear goal, and a fight. When we consider the major jihad and one own's development, we don't see it as a conflict. Should we see it that way? Who is the antagonist? Who are we battling against, so to speak? Do we see it like that? Should we see it like that?
Interestingly that you mentioned this, or you raised this, because it's very different way of looking at the challenge in itself. I am of the humble view, basically, that a challenge can be a very positive thing. Why I say this? Because if a human being, and I mentioned that in my lecture yesterday, I said if a human being is not challenged, he will remain stagnant. Anything that remains stagnant becomes poisonous, becomes dangerous. For example, a cup of water that is left for 3-4 months unchallenged becomes poisonous in itself. The human being, the human mind, the inner self of a human build-up, if it is not challenged, it becomes the devil's playing ground. So if you want to look at the challenge then from a perspective that it is a chance for reform, then definitely it's a positive opportunity, right, for you. But if you look at yourself as someone that is weak, vulnerable, someone that when the challenge comes his way or her way, is a challenge to your entire life, to your entire setup, then the struggle in itself is going to be much, much difficult than if you look at the challenge from a positive perspective. And looking at a challenge from a positive perspective gives you the idea that the achievement is going to be remarkable at the end of the day, because you are doing this in order to reform yourself to be a better human being. You are not in a battle within yourself in order to crush it. No, you are in a battle within yourself in order to elevate it. And if you are able to see it from that perspective, then any challenge that comes your way comes with a welcoming sort of approach to yourself. That's why, for example, maybe the example is not very much in tune with what we are talking, but it gives some sort of it alludes to that. Imam Hussein salawatullah wa alayhi, we're talking about Imam Hussein salawatullah wa alayhi. In one of his ahadith, very famous hadith, he says, إن حوائج الناس من نعم الله عليكم فلا تملوا النعم. What does the hadith say? He said, people's needs when they come to you are God's blessings sent your way or sent your way. So don't push them away. Don't despair from these blessings that are coming your way. Now, we have the right or the ability to look at people's need coming our way as a positive challenge or as a negative challenge. If we look at it from a positive point of view, then when we help, we will feel a sense of jubilation, a sense of attainment, a sense of completion. But if I see that challenge coming my way from someone's need, and I'm able to fulfill that need as something negative and something that places a burden on me, then I will not see the blessing in that. But if I see the challenge as something that I can triumph through, then definitely I will see the positiveness of the accomplishment of that challenge. Imam Ali salawatullah wa alayhi, when he was struck in his mihrab, he didn't see that as the end. He said, Fustu wa Rabbil Kaaba. That means his entire life was spent on the basis of challenges that he saw positiveness in them. And he's a ma'soom imam indeed. Imam Hussein, salawatullah wasalam, he sets out the whole criteria of his reforming message when he says, مَا خَرَجْتُ أَشِرًا وَلَا بَطَرًا وَلَا مُفْسِدًا وَلَا ظَالِمًا. I did not set out on the basis of, seeking these worldly affairs or being unjust. Or no. Then what is the basis of your revolution, your uprising, your reforming movement, or imam? He says, I just want to set things right. I want to call what is right and stop what is evil, the aggression against human rights and people who are suffering by that aggression that has been put against them by certain rulers and certain people in power, So he came out with a positive approach. And he wanted to communicate that positive approach to people so that they can take it on board as well and look at a challenge from a positive approach. However, we can't deny the fact that the legions of evil that work within us, such as temptations, desires, the whispers that take place within us, if we don't deal with them appropriately, then they could be a cause of annoyance, a cause of disturbance to us. And that's why I think the concept of major jihad was always linked to the question of struggle or the question of fighting or the question of, but is fighting or struggle a negative term in itself? Or is it actually a positive term in itself? It depends on the person himself looking at the challenge from what perspective he sees that challenge coming to him or to her in that regard.
I know we're going to be going to a break soon.
Sure.
But very quickly, just I understand. Obviously, you've got the glass half full perspective looking at this. You have to look at it positively. I'm just trying to get my point of view across in that maybe I'm seeing this wrong in that when we look at this idea of major jihad, you've mentioned the temptations and we should be very risk averse of these temptations. And there is a hadith that comes to mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, I may be mistaken here, but it's something about the temptations and how our aql should be in command. And the hadith or the saying goes that our temptations or our lower self is like a wild horse.
That's right.
So we should constantly be aware of it or constantly be ready to make sure it's going in the right way, because it is something that it can be dangerous, it can jump.
Derail us, basically, yeah, indeed.
Or likewise, when we look at the idea of the smaller jihad, we have the idea of a clear enemy. And when we have the idea of an enemy, though of course I'm trying to gain from you the positive way of looking at it. When we have an enemy in the minor jihad, the way the Quran even highlights that, you need to be aware. And when you do have an enemy and someone that's maybe trying to take your livelihood or attack Islam or something like that, you're very much aware, your senses are heightened, it's a battle. So you're not going to be distracted by something small or something happening in the background. You know you're in a conflict.
Sure.
Should that metaphor, that kind of analogy be placed here when it comes to these temptations that, we may think it's not that big a deal, but really it could actually destroy us. And if that was the mindset, then maybe, I don't know, the point I'm trying to get, should we be in that conflict mode? That, of course, we're trying to attain something positive, but should we be on guard the same way that we would be on guard had we been on a battlefield? Is that a similar way of looking at it?
It's a perfect way of looking at it. What I was trying to say when I spoke about being positive rather than being negative, I'm talking about the overwhelming concept of being in that state, of guarding yourself against these temptations. If you will look at the entire setup from a point of view that it's a negative struggle, you're going to be tired. And I don't think God envisaged for his creation to constantly be in a worrying state or a worrisome state. Rather, he wants them to look at the overwhelming concept of a challenge in a positive way, so that when they deal with it comfortably. Though it's a challenge, there is no qualm about that. There is no dispute about the fact that you need to be on guard. But being on guard, does it have to be associated, for example, with stress, with depression, with anxiety? No, that's not what is anticipated. For example, one of the qualities of a mu'min is that he's always mutma'in, he's always tranquil. But that does not mean that a mu'min is not being challenged. In fact, a believer is more challenged than anyone else in life, yet he remains composed in that challenge. He remains in that, state of tranquility, in the state of radi, mardi, Ya ayyatuha an-nafs al-mutma'inna, irja'i ila rabbiki radiyatan mardiya. Incidentally, it's talking about also Imam Hussein salawatullah wa salamu alayhi, that he had acquired that sense of tranquility, and that sense of perfection of having that ability to be in that state of absolute tranquility, despite the fact that he was, as you put it, head on with the enemy in the battlefield of Karbala. Yet you see his dua in Karbala when he communicates with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it shows how perfect and tranquil Imam Hussein was, despite the fact that he was being beaten, being hit with arrows and swords and lances and even rocks by his enemies, yet he remained composed. One of his enemies, for example, he says, he looks at him and he says, I have never seen anyone in my life being hit, being tormented, his family being persecuted, and him being physically tortured, yet he remained so composed in the way Hussein was. ما وجدت مكثورا, يعني someone who has been overwhelmed by problems like Hussein was, yet he remained composed in the face of that challenge. That's what I'm trying to say. In order to put yourself constantly with the challenge from the perspective of always being anxious, that is going to undermine your ability to find that challenge as well. So that's the point I'm trying to say. I'm not in any way trying to say, don't be alert. No, you need to be alert, obviously, just like if you are in a battlefield.
And I think that because it's obviously, it's not something that happens overnight, it's a step-by-step process.
100%. Yeah.
So I think with vigilance comes the tranquility.
Ahsant.
So if we just allow, our whims and desires to overrule us, and we feel like we're happy, but really, when things go wrong, then there's no tranquility, and we find depression, anger, anxiety, etc., etc. But like how you've clarified right now, it's become very clear that if you are mindful and you are awake and you are able to maintain this jihad, so to speak, it's actually what brings about the clarity,
100%,
the wisdom, the peace,
absolutely,
and even contentment with what we have, for example.
Indeed.
Otherwise, we're constantly searching for something or looking for something, and that's how we then end up losing the struggle.
And just to add to what you said, brother, is that with contentment comes a clearer ability to fight against that temptation. Because if you are clear-minded, you are in control, like the example you gave by Imam Ali of the horse, then you will be more equipped to stand in the face of that challenge than if you are disturbed, than if you are all over the place, than if your mind is not focused, and then the challenge will take over, or the temptation will take over because you are disturbed by it. You're saying to yourself, no, I can't stand in the face of that challenge. So you surrender because you are anxious. But if you approach that challenge with full vigor of control over that challenge, equipped with that sense of tranquility and peace of mind, then your ability to analyze the challenge is much more profound than if you are looking at it from a negative perspective.
I want to touch on this very briefly before we go on the break. Do you think as a community who are obviously striving and trying along this, do you think there's enough focus on this? Or do you think we often, obviously because these are wajibat and ahkam, etc., but we have, or it seems as though sometimes, maybe I'm speaking about myself, focuses a lot on rituals and how to make sure we are doing, for example, the wajibat correctly. But then we forget about the internal thing, maybe because there's nothing here with regards to the Sharia. The Sharia is predominantly outside on that, or things that material physically. But this is all like an internal struggle. Do you think we forget about this?
It's very interesting that you raised this point. In fact, I think there is a lot of negligence in that side of things. We don't focus much on the struggle within in order to bring out that the concept of a perfect human being. While if we examine Islam per se from a very in a depth point of view, you would find the entire Sharia actually revolves around the reform of the inner self. The whole idea of religion, the whole idea of even the obligations. For example, Salah. Why is Salah prescribed at certain times in a certain fashion, right? It is to give you that sense of organizing yourself, the ability to be focused, the ability to be determined, the ability to take matters in an organized way, in order that it would equip you to stop whatever temptation that may take place later. For example, a youth approached me once in our community and he said, tell me the definition of a mu'min. I said, you tell me. What is your perception of a mu'min? He said, someone that prays in the front line. I said, fine, good concept. What else? Someone that keeps a bead. All right. Someone that observes the month of Ramadan. Someone that goes to Hajj. I said, they are all interesting concepts. But let me tell you this. Let me throw this proposition at you. Let's assume hypothetically that there is a person that does all these rituals, right? But then after leaving the mosque, he lies. How do you classify this person? Does he remain within the body or the realm of a mu'min? Would you see him as a mu'min? Of course, we're not being judgmental. Allah is the ultimate. But I'm saying as a perception, as a concept. He said, obviously not. I said, then the focus should not be only on the rituals. The rituals are simply means to perfecting and stopping the other evils that are constantly within us, such as lies and backbiting and so on and so forth. So all these rituals have come in place as means of obligations in order to give you an opportunity to reform yourself.
Ahsan, thank you very much for that. Want to, thank you, and
pleasure.
Please stay tuned for the second part of the show, and please take the opportunity to call in and pose your questions to the Shaykh on this very important topic. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome back to Ahlulbayt Live, where we've been joined by Shaykh Jihad Ismail. Assalamu alaikum. Who's been kind enough to give us some of his time to discuss a very important topic. We're looking at jihad in both times of peace and war. Before the break, we discussed various different things, and we ended looking at how we can often pay too much attention on the material sharia, the things that we need to do, salah, saum, etc., and not necessarily forget, but maybe not give as much importance to the inner aspects. And you highlighted that all of these things are focused, focused for that.
Indeed.
Is there anything you'd like to add before we went to the break with this specific?
Well, basically, if you look at, if you take a closer look at all the rituals, for example, in Islam, fasting, for example, salah, hajj, they are all geared towards giving you enough scope, enough material, enough tools in order to basically curb these temptations and desires. So if it happens that you pray, for example, 5 times in a day, so these 5 daily prayers are to equip you for the next of the day to use and utilize what you get out of salah in order to curb these temptations. Fasting comes once a year. So what do you do between this Ramadan and the next Ramadan? Muharram, the epitome of struggle against oppression and aggression, whether outwardly or inwardly, right, comes once a year. So what do we do with these rituals? Do they remain rituals by season that we don't need to utilize them into our day-to-day life? Then if we do so, then we have failed the entire concept of these rituals or these ibadat or these obligations, whatever you want to call them. Rather, if we look at them as a positive means to continue the journey for the rest of the year, for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week, for example, then we will have the opportunity to be more focused on reform within the self rather than just being, robotic about our acts of worship that we observe on a daily basis or a monthly basis or a yearly basis, for that matter.
Ahsant. When I was trying to research for this topic to prepare, often something that I was reading, and this was coming across also from Western thinkers who would look at this kind of inner struggle, many of them would highlight the idea of the ego as a central point when it comes to this idea of the inner struggle. So obviously we have references towards this in our own text when it comes to, for example, pride, and even anger, etc. A lot of these things can always be pointed and refer back to this ego, this inner voice, so to speak, where we have a certain idea of what or who we are and how we should be treated or how things should go. And often life, as it plays, doesn't always go
The way we want.
the way we want,
Yes.
right? So, you know, and sometimes it's our egos, or it could be that element of our inner self is what, you know,
Plays.
what triggers,
Contributes.
yeah, exactly. What are your thoughts? What have you come across in
Look,
terms of...
the Quran is very emphatic on that subject. I mean, it all started with Adam and the devil, or Satan, for example, for that matter. And if you look at the crux of the issue, it's actually all about ego. It's not about rejecting the order itself, right? It was about making an analogy or a comparison between who's better than who, and rejecting the command was a secondary reaction to the preliminary problem. And the preliminary problem is that the ego played in part into the rejection of the act of obedience on the part of Satan. So I think it's like God is telling us right from the outset, you know, whenever you want to look for reform, start with ego. See, how do you compare to ego? How compatible are you against that concept, so that you don't allow your nafs to grow on the basis of ego? Because once that takes place within you, then your fight is going to be one intense fight that you may not be able even to overcome over the course of time. And once ego kicks in, then all the other ailments of the heart will also give rise. For example, ujub, pride, as you said, you know, self-conceit, you know, and all these concepts, hasad, envy of others. All it revolves around the problem of ego. It's like, if I may say this, even if I may go to the extreme point of view in that regard, but that's how I feel about it. I feel that everything that God gave in terms of commands and obligation, everything the Imams actually struggled for and came with, is actually to curb us against ego, and to show us and highlight to us how devastating it is to surrender to our nafs on the basis of egoism, on the basis of allowing our nafs to be under the control of that self-ego, or whatever you want to call it. And it gives rise to being narcissistic, you know, falling in love with your own self to the extent of, you know, just worshipping your own self. Allah says, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you seen he or she that takes as its own Lord its own vainglory? You know, and that's how important it is to realize that the fight begins, if I want to use the word fight, or the struggle begins with controlling the ego. If we do not concentrate on the control of the ego, we will not be able to achieve anything after that.
And you're right, you touched on various different things, you know, the idea of that self-worship. So you've got an idea of shirk coming in.
Absolutely.
And I think it becomes so prominent, and often we forget about it, or we fail to realize it, you know, because, for example, other temptations that we may feel, sometimes it may be easier to give up on. I don't know, whether it's a desire for cake or whatever it is, or anything.
Indeed.
It could be any other desire, but this idea that, oh no, he's made me feel bad.
Exactly.
Or, you know, I should be respected in a certain way, or I have reached a certain status, or even if it's just within yourself, you just, you know, or even it could even be, this is where it becomes quite tricky, where you may be trying to do a good thing, but then you become prideful of that, and your ego says, you know, you've done well, you presented the show very well, you know, and you feel you've done something, and it's sometimes you don't even realize and it's happening, and it's playing, and it just goes so unnoticed. Indeed. And it could go weeks, months, years, and that struggle goes unchecked almost.
In fact, you know, Imam Zayn al-Abidin from memory was asked about that by one of his followers, that sometimes we attain a sense of like jubilation, happiness, that we've perfected an act of worship, or we fulfilled an act of worship. Is that in itself bad? So the disciple is asking the Imam, is that in itself bad? He said, as long as the sense of jubilation is that you are pleasing Allah, then you are still within the body of being safe. But if it goes towards self-infatuation. It's not because you've achieved something that Allah is pleased with. Rather, it is something that you personally feel that it's an achievement on your own or by your own self, then that is the start of deviation. Because, you know, the term that we often use, but it goes unchecked in terms of its meaning, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah al-ali al-azim. What are we saying actually? We are saying that there is no ability, no power, no sense of control to go towards good or to prevent ourselves against evil if Allah did not will it. So we are always seeking the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through our, of course, freedom of choice or freedom of willpower and so on. But we are always resorting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to always make us within the body or the parameters of having His permission to remain within the fold of what is good and to prevent what is evil, or have the might to pursue a life of felicity and happiness and goodness and you know, that is based on righteousness, as opposed to a life that is based on evil and so on and so forth. So looking at that struggle within, if you constantly attach whatever you do to the pleasure of Allah, then you're safe. And this brings me also to a hadith or in honor of Sayyida Zahra salamullah alayha. And I touched upon that also yesterday. When the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said about Az-Zahra that inna Allah yarda li ridaha wa yaghdabu li ghadabiha. God is pleased at the behest of Fatima's pleasure, and He's angered at the behest of Fatima's anger. Now the question is, it is always in the reverse. In fact, we are always struggling to get God's pleasure and to remain away from God's wrath or anger. Well, in that example, it's in the reverse. God is pleased at the pleasure of Fatima and angered at the anger of Fatima. The question that arises here is, how is that possible? And why? That God is pleased and angered at the behest of a human being. The issue here is what? Is that Fatima was never pleased or angered on the basis of her own self. Her pleasure, her anger was always channeled where? Towards the pleasure of Allah and the anger of Allah. And in retrospect, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to reciprocate that endorsement of someone's happiness or pleasure and anger, because it is channeled within that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not based on self-conceit or ujub or any form of these ailments of the heart. If we can achieve that sense of awareness, you know, اعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. Worship God, the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Worship God as if you can see Him. Since God is not a mass, you can't see Him, then be assured that God is always seeing you, is always observing you. So worship Him from that perspective. If you do so, then you've already developed a sense of, you know, things going checked all the time and not unchecked, and being oblivious to being happy with your achievement on the basis of your own achievement rather than on the basis that God is pleased with what you have done.
Yeah. You've hinted at a number of points that can be elaborated to become practical tips that would help the viewers. Can you touch on any other that you feel that these tips would be specifically for this, that would help the viewers, you know, realize that this is something that we can't be lax about, you know? Sure. It's something we need to be. Yeah.
Indeed. I think in the hadith of Ahlulbayt, we have a lot of references to such tips that we can utilize or basically benefit from. For example, the hadith by Imam al-Kadhim, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, from memory, he says, ليس منا أهل البيت من لم يحاسب نفسه في كل ليلة. He is not among us, the people or the family of the household, if he does not bring himself to account. Bringing oneself to account on a daily basis. Like, for example, an accountant, at the end of the day, he goes through the whole day of what he has done, what accounts he has kept. He audits basically these numbers. We need a form of auditing for our actions through the day. And that cannot happen by someone who's observing our action. We need to be true to ourselves. And that's why the Imam says, you must spend some time, and Imam Ali also has a similar saying, you must bring yourself to account on a daily basis. So this is what we call accountability. Then we have muraqabah. You know, muraqabah means what? Observance. Throughout the day, there has to be some sort of a, you know, a chart that I tick during the day. Self-checking chart, if I may use this terminology, which is called muraqabah. That I'm about to do something. Is that something that I'm about to do falls within the pleasure of Allah or falls within the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If it falls within the pleasure of Allah, then continue. Nothing should stop you. Go for it, you know, because you are constantly monitoring, self-monitoring of yourself. If we break the condition of self-monitoring, then we have to stipulate another tip. That tip is called musharata, self-conditioning, or placing a condition on yourself. For example, I have set out to say that today I'm not going to lie. Let's say, hypothetically, right? Today I'm not going to tell a lie. I break that self-stipulation, you know, or that condition. Then I broke that tip of musharata, which I have put on myself. I put a shart on myself, a condition on myself that I will not break that rule today. If I did, there has to be a sort of compensation. What is the compensation? Maybe go out and clean someone's house who can't afford to clean it. Maybe going, this is too far. Or maybe, for example, add an extra 2 prayers at night. Or maybe go and visit someone who's sick in hospital because I broke that condition. If I can stipulate muraqabah, musharata, muhasaba, you know, self-accountability within my day-to-day transactions, dealings, whatever I'm doing in the day, then you will find yourself automatically going towards a path of righteousness, a path of guidance, because you've become conditioned, you know, not conditioned in a way that you become accustomed to it, because there's danger in that. If you do things out of habit, then everything becomes useless or meaningless. Imam al-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, for example, in one of his ahadith, he says, don't look at people's prayers and people's fasting. Don't even look at their prayers and singing in the middle of the night. وَلَا تَنْطَنَتَهُمْ بِاللَّيْلِ, meaning salatul layl. But look at their actions and their amana, their sense of trusteeship. Are they trusted people? Can you trust them? And about the way they deal with others. Are they utilizing these things, these obligations, these rituals that we were talking about earlier, in order to reform themselves through the transaction they do during the day or not? If they're not, then all this is wasted. Why? Because the Imam clarified. He said, because it has become a habit. It's a habit to them. They don't look at it as a self-conditioning, reforming tips for their self to be a better human being.
Ahsant. I wanted to, I think the discussion has been, you know, really fruitful in terms of, yeah, definitely some of the concepts that we've touched on. I think we've got more than I anticipated, so I'm very, very thankful in that respect. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was taking it back historically. You know, when it comes to our history, we were working on another documentary, and I was just doing some reading about our history. You often hear this idea, obviously in the media as well, that Islam was spread by the sword. You know, and the idea of jihad has been tainted to such an extent where this is now synonymous with, you know, the idea of jihad is the idea of conquest. When you look to analyze this, you think this is not fair. Indeed, right? This is not fair. But then when we look at history, often, and correct me if I'm wrong, when we look at what happened, you know, even when we look at the Battle of Karbala, what happened there, and we look at, you know, what happened to the other Imams or what happened thereafter, we find that there were various different dynasties that ruled, various different caliphs, various different households, and these were in different countries as well. You know, it spread as far as, you know, as far as Islam spread, you had different dynasties, and this idea of jihad being misused to expand the territory. I mean, is this something that we have to admit to? Is this reality? Is this something that when someone says Islam was not spread or was spread by the sword, from my recent readings, it's something that I can't, has jihad been misused by Muslims more than has been misused by people who are now describing jihad as the way it's being described in the media?
I think if we want to be honest to ourselves and not hide behind a straw, we need to admit that the concept of jihad in that particular context, as you put it, rightly put it, has definitely been misused and hijacked. If you look at all the dynasties that followed the Prophet ﷺ, came after the rule of the Prophet ﷺ, with the exclusion, of course, of the rule of Imam Ali, and I don't want to be in any way unacademic in my approach, you would find, for example, that there were expansionist views. They were not jihadist views, in the sense that we are using jihad in a positive sense. Bani Umayyah, the dynasty of the Umayyad, the dynasty of the Abbasid, the dynasties of the Mamluk, the dynasties of the Ottomanis, whatever the case may be, they were not for Islam. Where did Islam play a role in the expansion of these dynasties? On the contrary, Islam was misused in order to reinstate that seat of aggression, that seat of power in the hands of people that misused it in order to con Muslims themselves into believing that if they join the army, they're doing it for the sake of Allah. There's no sake of Allah here whatsoever. It was for the sake of the ruler, for the sake of expanding that piece of land that this ruler was taking control of. And even historically, this is proven. You would find that every battle and every war that was fought in the name of so-called Islamic jihad, during the time of these dynasties, had gone back to its rightful people. Philippines, Spain, the north of France, because they were not for God's sake. And if they were for God's sake, you would not wage war on these people. Why would you wage war on these people? But if you see, on the other hand, that those who went peacefully to engage in what we call, if I can use this terminology, da'wah work, or spreading the word of Islam through actions, through eloquent speech and what have you, remained Muslims. For example, Indonesia, it turned Muslims on the basis of transactions. Honest, hard-working fishermen or businessmen that interacted with the people of that Asian country on the basis of their honesty. They were summoned to the king's courtyard. He asked them what this faith is all about. Why are they so honest about their merchandise and the way they presented their merchandise, to the extent that the king himself was convinced and turned Muslim. And of course, الناس على دين ملوكهم. People follow what their kings believe in, and they turned Muslims, and they remained Muslims. Why? Because it was not forced for ulterior motives. It was not for the expansion of their countries or the expansion of their family dynasty. It was not war for Islam. And definitely I would say that when the West, unfortunately, see Islam as a religion that has been spread by the edge of the sword, we should actually endorse that and not stand against it, in the sense, and let me clarify so that people don't take offense to what I'm saying, in the sense that these people were not true representative of Islam. Islam was hijacked by these people, and they used Islamic law in order to justify the expansion of their territories, not for the sake of God, not for the sake of human integrity, not for the sake of human dignity, not for the preservation of life, but rather for the annihilation of any opposition in the face of the expansionist view. And Islam stands against that. The very message of Imam Hussein highlights that usurpation of power on the basis of family affinity or power or authority that is associated with aggression is something that Islam doesn't tolerate. And that's why he said, I came out for reform. So the struggle of Imam Hussein was for the sake of God. It was not for aggression. It was not for the annihilation of life. It was not for the subjugation of a human being. No, it was for the liberation of a human being. So his struggle was legitimized. His struggle was for the sake of a higher intention and a higher achievement. But what we see in different situations and setups is that jihad was misused. And in order to justify even, I will go a step further than that, some of the laws that are associated with what we call ridda, renegades, those who turn back against Islam, so to speak, as they classify them. Yani the concept of murtad, someone who abandons religion, so to speak. These have been so much abused within the so-called body of Muslims, I won't say Islam, and the dynasties that utilized Islam for their own benefit. They used or fabricated certain ahadith to legitimize fight against even Muslims on the basis that these Muslims have become murtad because they stood in the face of their government, or in the face of their political affiliation, or in the face of their political authority, right? Because these Muslims could not see eye to eye with them because they've usurped something that is not theirs. So they fabricated these laws about murtad, that he becomes, you know, if a murtad goes against the so-called Islamic establishment or Islamic government, then his money is halal, his nafs is halal, his soul is halal, his wife is halal, his children are halal, and they become, you know, the ownership of the state. This is what Islam all about? Islam came to fight against this. Islam has put rules and stipulated conditions not to encroach on the dignity and the standing of a human being simply because he may not agree with you on a particular stand, on a particular political. For example, in Islam, we don't have political prisoners. There is no such thing in Islam. Yet we find that most of the countries that so-called or ruled by Islam have political prisoners than any other prisoners in the rest of the world, right? And this goes against the very heart of the legislation of what Islam wants in terms of establishing justice and equity and human dignity in these setups.
Ahsan, thank you very much. Very, very insightful talk, and you know, thank you for those of you who are watching at home, and inshallah we look forward to Thursday, inshallah, where we continue with another topic, and inshallah we will meet then.
Thank you for availing me of the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for watching at home, and inshallah we will see you again tomorrow for Ahlulbayt Live. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.